All right. Now, I just wanted to share the schedule again with you. No, this is not. Wrong one. Sorry. Hold on a minute. Here. This is. All right. So we're covering chapters 3 and 4 this week. And hopefully you'll have the textbook this week. And that way you can read the book, if you have to catch up, make sure you read all 4 chapters, pay attention to definitions and things like that, I've been bringing them out during class also. We do have quiz number 1 next Tuesday, so a week from today. And that will cover definitions and concepts in the first 4 chapters. There's not that many, but there are some. So you do definitely need to go through those 4 chapters. Make sure you read everything. Don't just bring the book with you and not have read anything. People who do that typically do very poorly on the quiz because you're finding yourself looking everything up and then you run out of time. So it's best to read everything, be familiar with where all the definitions are, so that when you take your quiz, you can quickly get to that part of the book. All right. Any questions about that? So quiz number 1 will be next Tuesday, at February 9th. All right. And then you could see that the following Tuesday, we have quiz number 2 and a review for test 1. And test 1 is going to be Thursday the 18th. Right? Yes, there was a question? No question.
Yeah, I was saying, no, yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Professor, can you hear me?
I can hear you, yeah. What's your question?
Can you hear me?
I said I could hear you.
So this is, I guess it's like going in and out. For the quizzes, you said it's multiple choice, right?
No, fill in the blank. You have to write in the words. So you have to actually have access to your book and read the book ahead of time so you know where your definitions are. Right? I mentioned that before, but it's open book. So it's a vocab quiz with open book.
And I will email you. I will at the end of the class. When everybody gets off, I just need like a few minutes of your time.
All right, sure. Okay, so if you put yourself on mute, because I'm going to start talking about chapter number 3 today. I just wanted to show you the schedule so that you can see that. All right. So let's share screen again, and we'll get to chapter 3. All right. So again, definitions, you're going to look for them. I'll point them out again when I go through the videos. During our sessions here, and then it's going to be recorded. So you'll be able to go back and access all of this. All right, so this is called Measurements, Mistakes, and Misunderstandings, this chapter. And again, we start off in the slides with some what are called thought questions, just to get you warmed up. So suppose you want to find out what people feel or felt to be the most important problem facing society today. Suppose you had a questionnaire you were filling out, and there were 2 types of questions that could answer this particular, or 2 types of formats that could answer this question. One format would be that where you would be given a fixed set of choices, and you just check the box, the one that is the one that you feel is the most important, or you have an open-ended question that you are free to put any answer that you want. All right. So which one do you think would be better? And just mention maybe an advantage or disadvantage of each of the choices. So fixed set of choices given to you. In other words, you don't make the choice of what these choices are. You look at the choices and you check the box, the one that makes the most sense in terms of the most important problem facing society today, or you're given a open-ended question where you're free to write any answer that you want. Which one is preferable to you?
I think the open-ended question, because you see what people actually think instead of the set ones that you think that they might have an
Good.
opinion.
So that's an advantage of the open-ended question, and you answered the disadvantage of fixed sets, right? Fixed set questions. All right. What's an advantage of the fixed set of choices? Anybody want to have an answer to that one? Any advantages to that?
It's easier to count.
Yeah. Yeah, easier, right? Easier to count or code, right? You want to code the answers so that you can analyze them later. Absolutely correct. So for the researcher, it's easier to just give a fixed set of choices, right? So that's an advantage. Absolutely. All right. So, and I would just say one more is that if you have an open-ended question, it's possible the person didn't answer the question, right? They didn't understand the question. They answered some other question, put some nonsense down. So open-ended questions could also be have a disadvantage too if they're not answered correctly. All right, here's another thought question. You and a friend are each doing a survey to see if there's a relationship between height and happiness. Without discussing this in advance, you both attempt to measure the height and happiness of the same 100 people. What is more likely, this is kind of phrased not very well, but what would be more likely that you would agree on your measurement of height or your measurement of happiness?
How would you really like measure happiness?
Yeah, that's your question actually.
One can be measured and one can't be.
All right, well, I think you're hitting on a good point. It's what you're saying, it's easier to measure height than it is happiness, right? Height is something that's everybody knows.
Numerical, yes, height is numerical, but happiness isn't.
Yeah, so this is a problem that social scientists have always grappled with, right? They do want to look at something like happiness or some emotion, right? They want to study it, but how do you measure it? So people have come up with measures of this, of happiness, and they basically have usually a set of questions that to them measures the degree of happiness. And you bring up another point. How do you numerically do that, right? Well, you have to have some scale, a scale of some sort, like 1 to 5 or 1 to 100 or something like that, where you can come up with a number. Now, you may say, all right, fine, but how do you know it's correct? Well, there's a little bit of subjectivity involved with that, right? With height, there's a way of measuring height. It's most people would agree with. So good, that was a very good answer. I liked it. Here's thought question number 3. A newsletter distributed by a politician to his constituents gave results of a nationwide survey on Americans' attitudes about educational issues. So here's one question in the survey. Should your legislature adopt a policy to assist children in failing schools to opt out of that school and attend an alternative school, public, private, or parochial, of the parents' choosing? From the wording of the question, can you speculate on what answer was desired? In other words, the question is a yes/no question, right? Should your legislature adopt a policy to assist children in failing schools to opt out of that school and attend an alternative school? All right. Now, can you speculate on what answer was desired by the politician? Yes or no?
Yes.
Yes. Why? Why would the politician want you to answer yes?
So that he can get his legislator through.
Right. And what kind of legislation do you think he wants?
I don't know.
You don't know? All right. Anybody else? Well, look at the wording of the statement or the question. Yeah,
Is
the two
policy-
words here, failing
policy?
schools, failing schools. So according to this politician, schools are failing, right? They're failing. So, and what are they offering? Alternative schools. You see? So the question is leading you to say, yes, schools are failing. There should be an alternative school as opposed to supporting public schools, right? This is what I mean, if you wanted to take political sides here, this would be maybe Republican, right? A Republican issue as opposed to a Democratic issue, right? So the wording of questions on a questionnaire can influence the answers. And that's why if you hear any polling results, be skeptical. And usually the pollster will be able to give you, if you inquire, the questions on the questionnaire. So you could see if there was any sort of bias. This is bias towards answering a question a certain way. The questions in a questionnaire should be neutral, but this is definitely not neutral because they say failing schools, right? So that is, in my view at least, that's what the question is leading people to, saying, yes, there should be alternative schools. Schools are failing. We put money into these public schools, they fail anyway. So that's what this is implying. All right, here's another question. At a swimming pool with a friend, you become curious about the width of the pool. Yeah, that's what people typically think about when they are at a swimming pool, right? A friend has a 10-inch, 12-inch ruler, and he sets about measuring the width. He reports that the width is 15.771 feet, which is typically 15 feet, 9 1/4 inches. All right. You believe the pool is exactly that width, and what is the problem? Again, you can shout out. Do you think this is the pool's exactly 15.771 feet?
No,
No, and why not?
because he used a ruler instead of a proper measurement.
Right. Yeah, a measuring instrument, the ruler is not very good. That's good for measuring short distances, right? But a pool's width, where it's, quite a few feet across, or it's definitely not a good instrument. So most likely, do you think it is a problem with the measurement, right? Measuring instrument? Yeah. Right. That's the problem in this case here. The measuring instrument isn't good enough. So there could be error in the actual measurement. All right, if you were to have your intelligence or IQ measured twice using a standard IQ test, do you think it would be exactly the same both times? Yes or no? Probably haven't thought about these things before, but sometime in your life you probably measured a couple different times or some sort of intelligence test. Do you think you would get the same score both times?
Probably not.
No. And what factors might account for the differences?
You could probably get lucky for some questions, like
Lucky,
answer
alright.
differently another time.
All right, and what else could be affecting it? Besides luck.
You can learn more after taking the first one.
Well, let's say that the tests were given 1 month apart. Let's say you weren't really learning that much in between. What else could affect your scores?
The test could be different.
You didn't do as well as you did the first time.
Okay, tests would be different. Let's say it's the same test. And let's say you forgot about what was on the test the first time. Exactly the same test. What could give you different scores? I'm trying to nail it down a little bit more then.
I would think stress.
Yeah, it's different factors that could be affecting you those days. Yeah,
Mhm,
stress,
mhm.
amount of sleep, right? what you ate. Yeah, all sorts of things like that could change the scores, even if it was exactly the same test, exactly the same conditions. These things could be different in affecting your test score. Right. Good. All right. All right, so here's one conclusion from what we've gathered so far. There's simple measures just don't exist, right? Now, you know, height and weight, yes, we do have scales, we do have measuring instruments for these types of things, but there's always problems with measurement, and they have to be understood, and we want to minimize those problems. So we have to understand how we collect information and what's measured or asked. Okay, things that typically you take for granted, right? When you hear people give information about things, you take for granted that measurements were done precisely, questions were answered absolutely without any error, and yet that's not really the case, right? There's always issues with measurement. Even when we deal with questionnaires, words can make big changes in answers. In other words, the question could be essentially the same question in different questionnaires, but in one questionnaire, they just change one word and it could make a completely different response pattern in that questionnaire as opposed to the other one. And here's an example here. Students were asked questions about after showing or seeing a film about a car accident. All right, so they see this car accident, and one question is about how fast were the cars going when they contacted each other, and the other question is about how fast were the cars going when they collided with each other. Notice that you just changed one word here, right? Contacted and collided. That's pretty basically ignoring anything else that's there. And notice that when they said contacted, the average response was less, and when they said collided, the average response was greater. They saw the same car accident, but when the person was asked how fast cars were going when they contacted each other, they tended to answer a lower speed than if they said collided, because collided makes it sound like they were going faster, right? Even though they were looking at the same car accident. All right, nothing was different about it. So words matter. Words change responses in questionnaires. All right, here's another one about this. Again, this book here has very old surveys, right? 2003. What is that? 18 years ago. Two versions of the same question. All right, in terms of teenagers and drug use. Half the teens were asked about buying these items and the other half about obtaining them. Same items, all right? And let's look at the items, what they were: cigarettes, beer, marijuana. They were basically asked, is marijuana easy to buy or hard to get? And then, of course, they were asked about these other things. In terms of buying, if you look at the responses here, if the word buy was in the question, 35% of the people said it was easy to buy cigarettes. I guess these are teenagers. And 39% said obtain, if the word was obtain instead of buy. Beer, however, it was easier for teenagers to obtain beer, in their view, than to buy beer, even though that's the only words that were different in the questions. Marijuana, easier to buy marijuana than it is to obtain marijuana. So you could see the words obtain and buy give different responses, right? Even though maybe the person who created the questionnaire meant the same thing. So we have bias. There's always these biases that are in questionnaires. We're dealing strictly with questionnaires here. And there are several types of biases that are mentioned here. So you should, when you read your book here in this chapter, just read through it, but then try to think about the differences between these types of biases and think about an example of each one of these in your own mind, so that you can understand what these biases are, so that when you see them on a test, that they're easy to recognize, right? You know, the book is giving their own examples, but think
Can
of
you
your,
go back really quick?
yeah. For what? What am I going
Yeah,
back to?
right there. Yeah, can you keep it there for just one more minute?
Okay, now I do post these in Canvas. All right, so you don't have to write them down. You can make notes about them if you want, but they are in Canvas, so you can always go back and I posted this already. All right, are you good? Yes? Okay. All right, what is deliberate bias? This is one of the worst types, right? Where an organization deliberately words a question so that you get a specific type of answer on the survey, right? And I'll assure you that in politics, you're going to see this. In business, you're definitely going to see this, right? Because you want the business wants you to buy their product. So if they give you a survey, they want to word the question so that you agree with their product being better. All right, here's an anti-abortion group's question. Do you agree that abortion, the murder of innocent beings, should be outlawed? All right, so they put the phrase murder of innocent beings in their question. What do you think you're going to answer? Do you agree that abortion? Well, yeah, many people are going to say, I don't want people to be murdered, right? So yeah, they're going to say, yeah, it should be outlawed. Here's a pro-choice group's question, the same type of question. Do you agree that there are circumstances under which abortion should be legal to protect the rights of the mother? A pro-choice, right, group is going to say rights of the mother, protect the rights of the mother. All right. So they're going to say, oh yeah, of course, I didn't think about that. Yes, abortion should be legal. All right. So you could see that each of these groups is trying to influence your answer by putting in their viewpoint into the question, right? In one case, their view, the anti-abortion groups' viewpoint is that abortion murders innocent beings, and the pro-choice group says abortion protects the rights of the mother. All right. So in both cases, you see the attempt to influence your answer. Instead of having a neutral question, such as, do you agree that abortion should be legal? All right, period. Right? That's your question. That would be neutral. All right. But here, they're saying, do you agree that abortion should be outlawed? Now here, of course, anti-abortion is saying outlawed murder of innocent beings. You can see where they're trying to influence your answer. And here, they're saying abortion legal, not outlawed, but legal, protect the rights of the mother. All right. So in both cases, you could see an attempt to influence your answer, yes or no. That's deliberate bias, right? You could see that, right? This wasn't innocently put together. This is intentional. Now, sometimes questions are worded and the bias is unintentional, right? Because the word could have many meanings, or it could be the meaning is not clear. Like this question, do you use drugs? Well, what do they mean by drugs, right? Are you
Right,
dealing
because
with?
they could mean any kind of medicine, or they
Yeah,
could, hard drugs.
that's right. It could, what do you mean, right? You have to be more specific, right? As opposed to just saying drugs. Prescription, do you mean, now most likely they don't mean prescription drugs, right? I mean, to be honest, it's probably mean illegal drugs, but somebody could interpret this as prescription drugs. What is the most important date in your life? Right? So somebody might say, oh, the day I got married, or the day I graduated from college. Or somebody else might say, oh, you mean the best date that I ever had, going out with somebody? I mean, do you mean that? You know, you could see, or of course, it could also mean a fruit, right? You like dates, but have you ever had what's the most important date that you ever had? That's silly, but you see the point. Words can have multiple meanings too, and it could be confusing to somebody which meaning it has. So that's unintentional bias, right? I mean, it could have unintentional consequences. Here's another one too. This is something that's been studied for many, many years. The idea that when you do take a questionnaire or complete a questionnaire, and if there's somebody else reading the questions to you, there's a desire to please that person who's asking the question. It's just something, it's just automatic for many, many people. They want to make, they kind of think in the back of their mind that this person's asking it for a reason and they don't want to look bad and all that sort of thing. So what happens? People tend to underestimate undesirable answers and overestimate positive answers. Doesn't that make sense? They want to look good. They want to look good. So they underestimate negative answers, overestimate positive answers. So if the question is about cigarette smoking, most likely you're going to say no, even though maybe you do smoke cigarettes, that sort of thing. So people, researchers kind of know that people do this, by just comparing their responses to other data that's out there. Like in this case here, the prevalence of people who say they smoke cigarettes is much lower than would be anticipated based on cigarette sales by companies that sell cigarettes. So there is definitely this sort of bias, the desire to please the person giving the survey. This one's kind of a funny one, actually. People do not like to admit that they don't know anything or know something. And I'll assure you, everybody in this class, including me, doesn't want to say, I don't know, all right? Because it makes us look bad, all right? Everybody's like that. Maybe you don't admit it, but there are times in your life where you do not want to admit that. So what kind of bias is this? All right. All right. When the American Jewish Committee studied Americans' attitudes towards various ethnic groups, almost 30% of the respondents had an opinion about Wizians. Now, who are Wizians? Anybody want to tell me who Wizians are? Ever hear of them?
Are they wizards?
Okay. You mean okay. Anybody else? Who are Wizians? Well, Nika, you're very brave for giving the answer there. You're very brave, because the answer is there's no such thing. People wanted to study to see if people would actually respond as if this group exists. Well, nobody wants to admit that they've never heard of it before, so they're going to actually answer the survey question as if they do exist. All right, so it says here 30% of the people answering questions about this fictional group called Wizians rated them in social standing above real groups that exist, like Mexicans, Vietnamese, or African Americans. They acted as if they exist. All right, so that is definitely kind of amusing. All right, if questions are to be understood, they must be kept simple. Complex questions or using very complex type of grammar doesn't work very well. Could be very confusing. Look at this first question there. Shouldn't former drug dealers not be allowed to work in hospitals if they're released from prison? That's confusing, right? Shouldn't former drug dealers not be allowed? That's a double negative in there, right? Double negatives always confuse people. What does that mean? All right, it's hard to know what that really means. Is it really saying Should former drug dealers be allowed to work in hospitals after? I mean, that's the way, that would be the better way of asking the same question. So sometimes the way it's phrased is too confusing. People don't know what it means. Also, and this is very common, sometimes people ask more than one question in the same question. You're asking about more than one thing in the same question. Do you support the president's health care plan because it would ensure that all Americans receive health coverage? There's two questions in that, right? Do you support the president's health care plan? And also, basically, do you think all Americans should receive health coverage? That's the other question that's in here, right? So you can't have more than one question in a question. But that is an issue there that sometimes shows up in questionnaires. So questions and questionnaires have to be very simple and very clear. And here's another issue, the ordering of questions. The ordering of questions can have an effect on answers. Here's an example. One question: to what extent do you think teenagers today worry about peer pressure related to drinking alcohol? Right after that, all right, sometime after that, another question: name the top 5 pressures you think face teenagers today. If this first question was before the second question, what do you think one of the 5 pressures you would write down would be? It would be the first thing, right? What's mentioned in the first question, right? It's fresh in your mind. You would say peer pressure related to drinking alcohol. Not that you would have thought about it on your own. It's possible that you wouldn't have, but the fact that it was asked earlier or before the second question means you put that answer into the second question's answer. All right. See what I'm saying? If it was reversed and the second question was asked before the first question here, oops, sorry about that. You might not have said peer pressure related to drinking alcohol, right? Because it wasn't even brought to your attention. It may not have been something you would have put down there. So you could see where the ordering of questions can affect your answers. In other words, giving you information that maybe you wouldn't have had when you answered a question. All right. Confidentiality, anonymity. All right. People answer differently based on the degree in which they are anonymous. Doesn't that make sense? If they think they're not going to be, their name's not going to be released, they may be more truthful, right? Than if their name was on the, was not released. All right? Makes sense, I think. I think it makes sense to everybody here. All right. Here's an example here of that, one of those biases we talked about earlier. The one about where you may be told about something and it doesn't really exist, right? That bias. What was the name of that bias again? Let's go back. Asking the uninformed, right? Person doesn't want to admit that they don't know something. Here's a 1995 Washington Post poll. 1,000 randomly selected respondents added this question about answered this question about the non-existent 1975 Public Affairs Act. In other words, they were asked about something that never happened. Some people say that the 1975 Public Affairs Act should be repealed. Do you agree or disagree that it should be repealed? All right. 43% of the people answering this question had an opinion. 24% agreeing that it should be repealed, and 19% disagreeing. So 43% of the 100% of the people who read this question actually had an opinion about it, even though this act does not exist. And here's even a funnier part of it. 2 groups of 500 randomly selected respondents were answering this type of question, and it was rephrased. So group number 1, 19 Now, remember, this is back in the 1990s, so Bill Clinton was the president. So President Clinton, a Democrat, said that the 1975 Public Affairs Act should be repealed. Do you agree or disagree? Group number 2, all right, so this is randomly, these people were randomly put into these 2 groups, so they weren't necessarily Democrats or Republicans. They were just randomly selected. So group 2, the Republicans in Congress said that the 1975 Public Affairs Act should be repealed. Do you agree or disagree? Well, in group 1, 36% of Democrat respondents agreed it should be repealed. 16% of Republican respondents agreed that it should be repealed. All right. So over twice as many Democrats as Republicans agreed with President Clinton, a Democrat. In group 2, all right, we just changed it to say Republicans in Congress said that the act should be repealed. In this case, it was reversed. 36% of Republicans agreed with it, 19% of Democrats agree with it. Almost twice as many Republicans as Democrats. So you can see this had nothing to do with Democrats or Republicans per se. This is about something fictional, and people voted based on what? Based on whether they agreed with a Democrat or they agreed with the Republicans. All right, it had nothing to do with the respondents' opinion about this Public Affairs Act, which, by the way, does not exist. It's fictional. So over 50% in each of the groups actually had an opinion about something that doesn't exist. Sounds familiar, right? Sounds familiar in today's world? Yeah, people have opinions about things that didn't happen or doesn't exist. That's not surprising, right? It's not surprising now that you see this, that these things happen. Been happening for centuries this way. All right, open or closed questions. We talked about that in the beginning. All right, open question. Respondents are allowed to answer in their own words. Closed questions, respondents are given a list of alternatives from which to choose an answer. So many times they'll put other as a choice so that a person, so that people can have other opinions too, and they would just choose other without actually saying what that opinion is. So here is the problem with closed questions. I think this might have been mentioned before. So this was basically based on a survey type questions. It says, what is the most important problem facing the country today? Open question results. All right, if it was asked as an open question, over half of the 171 respondents gave one of these 4 answers. All right, unemployment, general economic problems, threat of nuclear war, foreign affairs. All right, so these are the 4 answers that they gave if they were just free to give their answer, give their own answers. Suppose on the bottom here, suppose these are the 4 answers that were given in a closed question format. That means these were the choices: energy shortage, quality of public schools, legalize abortion, pollution. None of these, of course, are mentioned up here. Okay. And there were other choices too, by the way. These were just the top 4, right? Because if you look at the percentages here, it does not add up to 100%. And notice that it says these 4 choices selected, these 4 here, were only selected by 2.4% of the respondents in the open question survey. So in other words, the choices that were put down for the person to answer were not the ones that people were really wanting to put down in an open format. Right? There were only 2.4% mentioned these in total, mentioned these 4 choices here. And as you can see, they were interested in more other problems that exist, all right? Not these 4. So that's the problem with closed question formats, is they may give choices that are not really relevant to actual people. And I think that was brought out by somebody in our group here at the beginning. The problems with open questions. Let's look at the question in this case here. Name 1 or 2 of the most important national or world events or changes during the past 50 years. So here are the answers. World War II, exploration of space, assassination of JFK, Vietnam War, don't know, all other responses, all right? Those are the answers, types of answers. Closed results, suppose these were the actual choices, World War II, exploration of space, assassination, so they are mentioned here, Vietnam War, invention of the computer. Notice the invention of the computer is the largest, biggest choice when you were given these answers, these possible answers here. It was the biggest choice, all right? And yet, in the open format, it wasn't even mentioned at all. Now, how can that possibly be? That's because when the people read the open question, they paid attention to what? World events. They saw the word world events, and they sort of ignored what? Changes. So whatever phrase came first, they paid attention to that. All right. And that's what, of course, they mentioned here. These were world events, right? Types of, well, exploration of space is sort of world events. They did not mention the invention of the computer. That's not a world event. That's a major change in society, right? Invention of the computer. And that was the largest choice in closed question answers. So here's the problem with open-ended questions. If you give multiple types of parts to it, people usually don't pay attention to all those parts. They pay attention to only one of the parts. All right. And that's the issue with open-ended questions. People sometimes don't answer the question completely. All right. So moving ahead, let's look at defining what is being measured. Defining what is being measured. That's another issue, right? We measure something, and yet when it's reported in the media, it sounds like it's the same thing as another way of measuring something. All right. Notice these two reports. They talk about teenage sex. Teenage sex. One report says it's on the rise. Another report says it's on the decline. Guess what? This was from what? The same newspaper in Davis, California, on the same date at different parts of the newspaper. All right. Saying in one case it's on the rise, and somewhere else in the newspaper says it's on the decline. All right. It's crazy, right? Why? Why is it that one part of the paper says it's on the rise and another part says it's on the decline? Well, maybe it has to do with what is being measured. All right. So in report 1, it says that sexual activity among adolescents is on the rise. No indication that this trend is slowing down or reversing itself. Number 2, teenage boys are not living up to their reputation, seem to be having sex less often with fewer girls, and at a later age than teenagers did a decade ago. So here is what's the difference between the two studies. What's being measured is different. They're not measuring the same thing. Okay. In the first report, sexual activity is based on the age of the first sexual act. The age, all right, of the first sexual act. In other words, how early did somebody start having sex, all right? So these are the ages. Report number 2 has nothing to do with the ages, it has to do with the frequency. The frequency. So you could see age and frequency, you could have different answers, right? They don't have to mean the same thing. So you have to define clearly what is being measured, all right? And unfortunately, news outlets make it sound like what's being measured is exactly the same thing, and it's not. And that's why you're getting two different answers, because you're really measuring two different things. Here's another example here of you have to be careful what you're measuring. Now, this is actually pretty well known if you've studied economics at all. Bureau of Labor Statistics. This is a federal government agency. They're the ones who report unemployment rates, employment rates, things like that, right? So they have a definition. Now, I don't know if this has changed over time. It's probably changed since this book was written. But this is a definition at that time of unemployment. That means somebody, if a person doesn't have a job, is actively looking for work in the past 4 weeks and is currently available for work. All right. So that is the definition of somebody who's unemployed. So how do they come up with an unemployment rate? It's the number of people who meet the definition up here divided by the number of people who are actually in the labor force. All right. What's the labor force? It means people who are working plus these people, right? Anybody who is potentially working, either working or currently looking for work. That's the unemployment rate. But what's not included in the numerator here is what are called discouraged workers. Now, you may feel when you look at the definition of discouraged workers that it should be included in the unemployment rate. And some people think that if we do include this, the unemployment rate looks much worse than it really is. So let's think about whether you would include it or not. You're not in the labor force, right? Not in the labor force who want to be. Right? Well, that sounds like it should be included. You're available and are available for a job, okay? And who have looked for work sometime in the past 12 months, or since the end of the last job, if it was held within the past 12 months. So far, so good, right? But here's the discouraged worker, but who are not currently looking because they believe there are no jobs available or there are none for which they would qualify. Now, don't you agree that the fact that they are discouraged and decided, well, I'm going to stop looking for a while, you think they should be included in the unemployment rate? And yet they're not. And I bet you in today's world, there are plenty of people who are discouraged workers, right? And they're not being counted. When you hear the unemployment rate, they are not being counted, and they should be. So this is an example where measurement can be misleading. We're measuring something, in this case, unemployment rate. All right. Now, we were talking about happiness earlier, right? We're talking about, here's another one, stress. Very common word, right? You would think many different studies on stress in people, stress in kids, whatever. How do you measure stress? How do you measure it? All right. That obviously is something that would be maybe different from one researcher to the next. So you have to define what you mean by stress. So in this case here, maybe a series of questions are asked, and then there's a scale for each of the questions from 0 to 10, where 0 means you usually have no stress at all, and 10 means you usually have a very great deal of stress. Right? Of course, what do you mean by stress? It must be maybe being under pressure, maybe, but you have to define what that means also. And then you're being asked, which number would you pick to indicate how much stress there is in your life? And suppose these are the 3 results that researchers come up with: low stress, moderate stress, high stress. In other words, if you answer from 0 to 3, you're in the low stress group. If you answer from 4 to 6, you're in the moderate stress group. If you answer 7 to 10, you're in the high stress group. You could see this is just somebody's way of measuring stress, right? Does it work? Does it really measure stress? Well, there are ways statistically, way beyond this course, but there are ways statistically to gauge whether these responses actually are related to stress, all right? So, but you have to define what stress is, and this is not easy to do. Here's a question that the kids were asked. How often have you felt that you couldn't control the important things in your life? And then you're being asked from 0 to 10. Well, in this case, not from 0 to 10. How often have you felt that you couldn't control the important things in your life? Well, if you're asking to gauge stress, Number one, what definition are you using? Is this the definition? You can't control important things in your life? Is that what stress is? So you could see that if this study was given out, the results of the study were given out by the media and said children can't control stress, right? And you say, oh, okay. But if you didn't know what questions were asked to gauge stress, you wouldn't know really whether you would believe in that or not. So you can't gauge the media coverage of an important topic like this without actually looking back at the study and saying, all right, what questions were being asked? How are they gauging stress? This is what they mean by the reader is informed about how the researchers measure stress on any given study. If you're really going to be informed, you need to go back to that study, and then a lot of them are published. You could probably read the study, and you have to figure out, well, does that make sense? Okay, and not just take it at its word. Kids have problems with stress. So this is an important topic, that measuring attitudes and emotions and things like stress it's hard to do. It's hard to do, but there are statistical ways of doing it. It does take advanced statistics to understand it, more like a graduate level understanding of statistics. So it's well beyond this course, but this course is basically giving you some ideas that it's hard to do. So how do you measure self-esteem or happiness? A common method is respondents read statements and determine the extent to which they agree with the statements. So typically, you may have 5 choices, for example, right? Strongly disagree, all right? Neutral, agree, strongly agree, like that. It's like 5 choices, or you can even have 7 choices along a spectrum like that. That's typically the way the answers are given. And then when you code these once you get your answers, how do you code them with numbers? Well, you might say that strongly disagree is 1, disagree is 2, neutral is 3, agree is 4, strongly agree is 5, like that. You just assign numbers to each of these choices, all right? And then there's some statistical analysis that's done based on those numerical answers. So that's how it's done, actually, in real research. Okay, now, here's a case here where you could have misleading statistics that's given, right? Not uncommon with companies, with actual companies that are selling products. They'll skew statistics in their favor. All right. Here's a report by Levi Strauss, who creates, of course, jeans, right? I guess they're still in existence. This is a fashion survey conducted on 100 US campuses back many years ago. 90% of college students chose Levi's 501 jeans as being in on campus. So these are the choices in the survey. See any issues? Now this is the only choice that were for jeans. They didn't give a competitor's jeans in here. These were all different other types of clothing, right? Other types of clothing. This is the only one that was jeans. It's not surprising that college students, at least back then, liked wearing jeans, so they picked the jeans, and it ends up being Levi's jeans. They didn't mention any other brand. And then Levi says, look, 90% of college students love Levi's jeans. Well, that's the only choice here of jeans is Levi's jeans. So you have to be careful with advertising. I used to work as a financial advisor. And if you're familiar with investments, there are what are called mutual funds, and they advertise, right? Well, every mutual fund says they're in the top 1% in their investment returns. Every single one of them. Is it possible that every mutual fund is in the top 1%? It makes no sense, right? Can somebody always be in the top 1%? If I asked you, are you, if all the students here, are you all above average? All of you would say yes. How can that possibly be? How can you all be above average? The average includes you. Some of you are going to be above average, some of you be below average. The point of the matter is nobody wants to be below average. So they say, I'm above average. I'm the top 10%. I'm the top 1%. And what do the mutual fund companies do? They have the little blurb, little things at the bottom of the advertisement in words you can't see without a magnifying glass, explaining, oh yes, we were the top 1% from January to February of 1975. And of course, they've been a terrible mutual fund ever since, but they were 1% at that time, top 1%. Okay. Here's another one. Now this one's really, really, really misleading if you look at it. This, I don't know why the publishers of the book talks about cigarettes so much, but they do. Triumph cigarettes. I don't know if Triumph, there's such a thing as Triumph cigarettes. I've never smoked, I don't know. So they have these two brands, Triumph and Merit. And the advertisement by Triumph is Triumph beats Merit. An amazing 60% said the Triumph tastes as good or better than Merit. Look at the actual three choices here. 36% preferred Triumph, 40% preferred Merit, 24% said the brands were equal. So what does this company Triumph do? They take the 36%, add it to 24%, and look, and then say, wow, 60% think Triumph tastes as good or better than Merit. Is that misleading? Yeah, because Merit could also claim that 64% prefer them, that say that they that Merit cigarettes taste as good or better than Triumph, because 40 plus 24 is 64. This is not false, but it's misleading, right? And it's because people are manipulating statistics to make it look better than it really is by putting the word as good in there, right? People don't pay attention to the as good, they pay attention to the better. All right. Now, this section here, pay attention to definitions. All right, I'm telling you, definitions, you need to know this. So this slide here is starting to define some of the language we use in statistics. In general, well, number one, what is a variable? Now, if you remember from algebra, a variable is x or y. It may run from negative infinity to positive infinity, and it may be measuring something, right? We don't know what, but it could be measuring something. But typically, we talk about real numbers, things like that. In statistics, variables take on values, all right? And they are split into two types, categorical and measurement. What's categorical variables? All right. Another name for categorical, by the way, is qualitative. Qualitative. They typically are variables that have categories in them. Categories such as what? Well, types of cars on a car lot. Toyota, Honda, right? Hyundai. Those words are the values of a categorical variable, which is types of cars. They can be described in English words. They're categories, they're descriptive. You can't do math with them. There are two types of categorical variables. One type is ordinal, which means that the categories have an actual order to them. All other categorical variables are called nominal. There's no natural order. So what I just said, Honda, Toyota, Hyundai, the types of car models, right? Types of cars, they're nominal. There's no order in saying them. I can say them any order I want. It doesn't matter. But what if I was ranking, let's say in 2019, let's say 2019 before the pandemic, I was ranking the top 100 motion pictures in terms of global revenue. Global revenue means how much money did they make worldwide in 2019, and they ranked them from 1 to 100. The rankings, which you can't do order, you can't do math with them with rankings. You know, if you say 1 through 100, you could use the words 1, O-N-E, or you could put a number 1 in there. It doesn't matter. That is called ordinal because it is the categories are naturally in a certain order. 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way up to 100. Okay, so they are called they're called ordinal categorical variables because you can order them. It makes sense to order them. Now, measurement variables, on the other hand, are also called quantitative variables. And they're ones where we not only use numbers, but we can do math with those numbers. We're measuring something like height and weight, right? We can find averages of those numbers, and that it makes sense. So these are measurement variables are quantitative. Sometimes people distinguish between two types of quantitative variables, and this is a little complicated, but let me explain the difference. There's two types of quantitative variables. One is called interval, and the other is called ratio. Let me give you an example of a interval variable. Temperature. Now, suppose it's 20 degrees Fahrenheit today, and tomorrow it's 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Well, we can subtract those two numbers, right? And so say today, say tomorrow is 25 degrees warmer than it was yesterday, right? 45 degrees versus 20, we subtract those two numbers. Everybody says that, right? 25 degrees warmer, or say 25 degrees colder, whatever. But the important point is we can subtract the numbers. However, interval numbers, you can't divide them and they don't make sense. If I said on one day it's 60 degrees Fahrenheit, and then on another day it's 30 degrees Fahrenheit, I cannot say that on the day it's 60 degrees Fahrenheit, it's twice as warm as it is when it's 30 degrees. Right? We can't say that. All right? The degrees don't tell us the amount of warmth. It's just a scale. That's all it is. It's a scale. And also, with interval numbers, quantitative numbers, 0 is meaningless. If I say it's 0 degrees outside, it doesn't mean there's 0 warmth. It doesn't mean there's no warmth. Because you can convert the 0 to what? Celsius. Then you have negative number, which means the same thing as a 0 as Fahrenheit. So 0 degrees Fahrenheit doesn't mean 0 warmth. However, a ratio number, you can divide the numbers and it's meaningful, and the 0 is meaningful. Let me give you an example. Money. If I have right now on me $60 in cash, and you have $30 in cash on you, I can divide those two numbers and I can say I have twice as much cash as you do. Right? When we divide with ratio numbers, it's meaningful. Also, 0 is meaningful with money. If I say I have no money, it means I'm broke. I don't have any money. The 0 means no money. It's meaningful. So you see the difference between ratio and interval? Interval does not, you cannot divide numbers in interval. It's not meaningful. And interval 0 is not meaningful. Ratio 0 is meaningful, and you can divide numbers and it's meaningful. That's the difference between those two. And those are the two types of quantitative variables. All right, any questions about that? So two types of categorical variables, two types of measurement or quantitative variables. We can also talk about variables in a different way in terms of measurement variables, all right? So in the previous page, we talked about interval and ratio, but in general, we're also going to talk about measurement variables as continuous versus discrete. And this you definitely need to know right here. What is a discrete measurement variable? It means that the numerical values are a limited number of them, and you can place them individually on a number line. For example, the number of automobile accidents on a stretch of highway, there's only a limited number of them over a certain period of time, and you can plot the possible numbers on a number line. That's discrete. You can list the different values of the variable, and you can list them and you'll be done. A continuous measurement variable is it can have any value in a given range of values. In other words, if you plotted it on a number line, you have a left endpoint, a right endpoint, and any number in between is possible. Age, anything that we measure basically, age, the amount of gasoline in the gas tank, money, time, anything like that. We can have any possible value in between two endpoints. That is called continuous. Then you may say, hey, wait a minute. All right, when I weigh myself, I can only have a certain number of pounds that are showing up on my scale. But basically, weight is continuous because forget about the limitation of your scale. If your scale was able to go out to 100 decimal points, then you would be able to measure your weight to 100 decimal points. So the limits of the measuring instrument should not make it a discrete variable. It is still continuous. Anything that's measured is going to be continuous. Anything that you count is going to be discrete, all right? And that's the easiest way of remembering those two. All right, so we only have a minute left. Let me see how many slides I have left here, just 3. Let me just finish this up. There's 3 ideas in terms of measurement. And this you should read in your book over and over again until you understand it. Valid measurement means that the measurement is actually measuring what it claims to measure. For example, an IQ test is not a valid measure of happiness. Makes sense, right? So valid measurement means it's measuring what's intended to measure. A reliable measurement means that if you repeat the measurement over and over again, you should be getting a similar result each and every time, or the same result each and every time. That's called a reliable measurement. If we repeat the measurement, it should be very close to the measurement we got before. And another name for a reliable measurement is precision. A biased measurement means systematically off the mark in the same direction. A clock that's always fast, all right? A scale that with no weight on it says 2 pounds. These are biased measurements. Then we have to talk about variability. You can have variability when 2 or more measurements are different from each other. Variability could be due to measurement error. It could be due to natural variability, that things just naturally change from time to time or between people. Okay. And so there are three types of variability: measurement error, natural variability across people at the same time, or natural variability of the same person across time. Okay. And then you need to know, in terms of the heart of modern statistics, comparing natural variability to the variability induced by different treatments, maybe in an experiment. All right. If there were no variability within two groups, it would be easy to detect differences between two groups. And this is very important to remember. The more variability there is, so we have two groups of people in an experiment, one treatment, another treatment. The more variability there is within each group, the more difficult it is to detect differences between groups. Okay? And we'll get to that at a later time. So this last part of this chapter, important to read over, read it carefully yourself, make sure you understand it, and ask any questions that you have. Any questions about chapter 3? No questions? All right, so I'm going to stop the recording, and I will see you guys on Thursday. We're going to be doing chapter 4 on SAM.